Happy, happiest New Year to you and yours. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Britt's Fantasy Blitz, and of course, I am your host, Britt Flinn. I hope that you guys all took down your championships last night. And from what I've seen on Twitter, a lot of the family did. It looked absolutely like we dominated, which is what we love to see after all the hard work that we've put in. But for some of you crazies out there, it is not over yet. We still have week 18 left to go. So if you've got week 18 questions, throw them in the chat. But for today, we will be breaking down week 17, going over some of our fantasy kind of heroes, zeros, sleepers, and favorite rookies. And you know it, we need another therapy session. We already need it. And Sellers is in the chat. Happy New Year's, you fantasy champs. Back at you, buddy. You won one as well. So you were part of the family winnings as well. But we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Go ahead and throw your questions in the chat. I know everybody's watching the college football games. I know that I was. I almost lost track of time before the show, and I was like, I've got to get going. Happy New Year to Scampers and to Grumpy Sports Fan in the chat. And thank you so much to our producer, Brian Burns, for making this show as amazing as it has been all season long. But let's just go ahead and jump right into a Sunday night recap, because I don't know if you guys were like me, but my entire fantasy champions came down to last night. I had already sewn up two, which was great. At least we got two out of the way, right? But the one that I really wanted to win was I was completely finished. My opponent had Aaron Jones. And when AJ Dillon went out, I almost lost my mind. I was like, "Oh, they're up. They're up so much. They're just going to run Aaron Jones. It's bad. It's going to be bad." So I was panicking, but I ended up coming out on top. Sellers in the chat, if you guys don't know, my husband, was going up against Tucker Kraft, had everybody gone. He ended up winning by, I think, 2 points, which was great. It's enough that it will override a stat correction, but still close enough that it was still very, very dramatic last night. And Ani Coop in the chat, Happy New Year to you as well. Go Rams. And Seller says, Go Rams, won me a championship thanks to Puka and Kieran. Thanks for spoiling my thunder, Sellers. We're going to get into those guys later with our fantasy studs or heroes and zeros. And then the Tootsie Pop, Rachel, Happy New Year to you as well. And I'm so happy that you invited me to be in that Crushing It League, not just because I'm a back-to-back champ, but because it is an amazing group of really great analysts. And Rachel donated to my charity of choice as winning for the champion. So that's absolutely amazing. But getting back to the Packers and Vikings, this was a smackdown, y'all. 33-10. And I kind of thought when the Vikings announced that Jaron Hall was going to be their starting quarterback, that it was going to be a bad situation. Obviously, with Jair Alexander out, it wasn't that big of a deal. But, or I didn't think it would be that bad. But Hall is not it. Not only did the Vikings defense let up, but Jaron Hall just looked awful. He ended up getting benched for Nick Mullins, thank goodness, because otherwise Justin Jefferson was not going to be a factor at all. He still wasn't much of a factor, only with 10.9 points, but it was just too little too late. And now with this win, the Packers can actually still make the playoffs after Seattle lost to the Steelers yesterday. And then Bo Melton just coming out of nowhere, having the first 100-yard game for any Packers receiver this entire year and adding a touchdown on top. So for the Packers, just running down some quick stats here. Jordan Love was 24 of 33, had 256 yards, but he did have 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. We really do love what we've been seeing out of this young quarterback. And I will be the first to admit, I was very low on him. I did not like what I saw of his college stat line coming out of Utah State, all the interceptions that he threw. Whatever he's got going on in Green Bay, keep it up because it's working. Aaron Jones, as I mentioned, 20 carries for 120 yards. He was just going bananas. This was a back-to-back 100-plus yard game for him, even up against a pretty tough Vikings run defense. but he ended up getting it done for the Packers and getting it done for me as well because I did not lose my championship. Also, Bo Melton, like I mentioned, 6 for 105 and a touchdown. Jaden Reed, 6 for 89 and 2 touchdowns. I know that he won a few people their fantasy championships, but he did unfortunately go out with a chest injury where he had to get some CT scans and x rays done. Hopefully, he's back for week 18. If he's not, which I say hopefully, let me take that back. He's probably gonna be doubtful because if they're doing CT scans and X-rays, I feel like it's a pretty significant chest injury, but that just opens everything up more for potentially Dontavian Wicks if he returns, or again, Bo Melton. Then Tucker Kraft, 6 for 48. Again, a pretty decent showing if you're in PPR leagues, but not enough to knock my husband out of the fantasy championship. So we love that. For the Vikings, it was a much, much different story. Jaron Hall, 5 of 10 for 67 yards and an interception. Nick Mullins came in at halftime. Scott Fish, longtime Vikings fan, posted a poll for Vikings fans seeing if Nick Mullins should be the starter. It was overwhelming. It was 90% to like 10%. And so I don't know if they were listening to Scott Fish or if they just wanted to make a change at halftime, but whatever they did, it worked. He came in, threw for 113 and 1 touchdown, the only Vikings touchdown of the entire game. Ty Chandler, 10 for 40. Not great, but what are you going to do when you're down that much? Justin Jefferson, 5 for 59. Again, not great. And instead of Oliver being the tight end, the pass catching tight end, it was instead Johnny Munt kind of coming out of nowhere, 4 for 39 and 1 touchdown. Jordan Addison, 3 for 28, thumbs down. And then KJ Osborne, a big fat 0 on the stat line. Not what you wanted to see going into your fantasy playoffs. Just it was kind of gross all the way around. But for some top news and recaps, because still there are some of you playing for fantasy championships in week 18. By the way, if you are, tell your commissioner to change that. But the playoff picture is much clearer after yesterday's games. The Ravens locked up the number one seed in dominant fashion. I thought that the Ravens were going to win, but I at least thought that the Dolphins would keep it close. It was nowhere near close. Absolute insanity. The Dolphins are now sitting at number 2, but they could even fall to a wild card if they lose to the Bills next week, which is, of course, why they flexed that game to the night game. The Chiefs are locked into the number 3 seed. They knocked everybody out of the AFC West with their win, and the Browns are locked into a number 5 seed. Now, the Jaguars, Bills, and Colts are holding the remaining 3 spots, but the Texans and Steelers are on the bubble. The Texans and Colts do face off versus one another, so that's going to be a very important game. Um, Also, the Steelers kind of, I don't know what to think about them. They're here 1 minute and then they're gone, and I don't really know. In the NFC, the 49ers, Cowboys, and Lions are top 3. The Eagles did fall to the 5 seed after their loss to the Cardinals, and Ani Coop's Rams rounded out with the number 6 seed. The Buccaneers and Packers hold the remaining 2 spots, but the Seahawks, Saints, Vikings, and Falcons are all in the hunt. Even though, speaking of the Steelers, even though Kenny Pickett is expected to be healthy and ready to go, Mike Tomlin has already declared Mason Rudolph the starter against the Ravens next week. Now, the Ravens could go ahead and rest their starters since they've sewn up that number 1 seed, but I still don't feel that great with Mason Rudolph starting in a must-win game. There have been some serious shifts going on in the confidence. Everybody's putting jokes out on Twitter saying that Kenny Pickett's going to be a great backup quarterback in the NFL. Um, Kind of disappointing after just 2 seasons that he can't get anything going. Until they get stuff figured out with their offensive coordinator and their quarterback position, don't like where the Steelers are heading. Also, the Broncos are continuing to roll with Jarrett Stidham against Russell Wilson in week 18. They've already been eliminated eliminated from playoff contention. So, um, not a big shocker there, but talking about how Russell Wilson got that guaranteed contract and how that organization has handled it is just very shady and very disappointing. And it's going to be interesting in seeing where Wilson ends up after he either gets released and or traded. So, for a little bit of injury news as well for the rest of you guys playing, Jaden Reed did leave Sunday night's game with a chest injury and underwent the CT scans last night. He also had an x ray, and he'd been dealing with that chest injury going into last night. But we don't yet know if this is a new injury or if it is just a worsening of the existing one. So, we've got to wait for reports today after his x rays and CT scans come back. Also, AJ Dillon left with a stinger and did not return. Doesn't look like it's going to be anything major for him, but still something to watch if you've got Aaron Jones. Bradley Chubb unfortunately suffered an ACL tear in the massive blowout against the Ravens. And this was puzzling to me because I'm wondering what he was doing still in that game. The Dolphins had clearly lost. There were 3 minutes left in the game. Um, it just makes no sense for him to be in there. Tua also suffered a shoulder injury in that game, although he did downplay it and say that he was just sore and that it was nothing worse. So hopefully he'll be in there, but definitely not good news going up against the Bills in a pretty much must-win game if they want home playoff chances. Unfortunately for me, because I had Alvin Kamara in two of my championship matchups, he left in the first half with an ankle injury. He tried to test it at halftime, but was unable to come back. So we don't know really how serious it is, but it's not looking like it's good news if he tried to test it and wasn't able to. Normally, if it's something that they can bounce back from, they'll come back out. So we'll have to watch that closely if you have Kamara going into week 18. Eagles wide receiver Devonta Smith was seen on crutches and a walking boot after the loss to the Cardinals. And while that is initially pretty shocking, you don't like seeing your receiver in a walking boot, it only came back as a mild ankle sprain. So hopefully he can be back out there in week 18 in what is also a must win game for the Eagles. Christian McCaffrey also left Sunday's game, and it was revealed after the game that he is dealing with a calf injury, whether it's a strain, a pull, we don't yet know. Um, but I knew when Elijah Mitchell was in there on the goal line that something was up, something was happening. But I don't think that the 49ers really have to worry about it. So now he gets a couple of weeks with week 18 and with the bye to rest that. So he should be good to go for the playoffs as long as it's mild and nothing serious. Um, Seahawks running back Kenneth Walker is also listed as questionable after aggravating his shoulder in a loss to the Steelers. And then Titans quarterback Will Levis injured his foot and left early, although I kind of feel like it's better for DeAndre Hopkins if Ryan Tannehill is in over Will Levis. So that's our quick injury breakdown. Now I want to shout out the real winners of this week 17 fantasy leaders, because this week was absolutely insane. There were players who you thought were going to go off who didn't end up doing anything. Um, there were also players who had been semi inconsistent for fantasy throughout the course of the year who went off. And that guy that I'm specifically talking about is Lamar Jackson, going 18 for 21, only having 3 incompletions for 321 yards, 5 touchdowns. 5 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. An absolute MVP caliber performance from Lamar Jackson. You love to see it. What he was able to do with just his lack of receiving weapons. Odell Beckham didn't really do anything. Mark Andrews has been out, but Isaiah Likely stepped up in a big way. It was a huge week for him. And then we've already talked about him, but Jordan Love comes in second, 24 of 33 for 256 and 3 touchdowns. Going up against this Vikings defense, did not expect him to go off like that, but he absolutely went off. And then Justin Fields, 20 for 32, 268, 1 touchdown, 45 rushing yards, and 1 touchdown. He almost had the chance to run another one in. He could have padded his stats even more. What he did against the Falcons who have only allowed 6 rushing touchdowns on the season, I believe, was incredible. They shellacked them. We hear that snow is good for the offenses all the time, but this was definitely proof of that mantra. And then Grumpy Sports Fan asks, with McCaffrey's injury, is Lamar the MVP this season? Um, I think there is still a lot of discussion to be had on that, but I think that McCaffrey's injury makes it a lot more gray in that area. I would still personally lean McCaffrey because when Lamar went out, Tyler Huntley came in and he was still scoring touchdowns, getting things done. I would personally lean McCaffrey, but Lamar has a very good case also. So for the running back position on our leaders, we've got to go with Annie Coops. Kieran Williams from the Los Angeles Rams only had 87 yards on the ground, which wasn't a great yardage situation for him, but he did have 3 touchdowns, taking away all of Matthew Stafford's upside that I thought that he was going to have. And he also had 2 catches for 14 yards. This guy has absolutely been a league winner. And spoiler alert, preview, we'll talk about him later. Coming in second on the week in PPR formats is Isaiah Pacheco. 130 yards on the ground, 7 receptions for 35 and 1 touchdown. We didn't even think that he was going to play until yesterday morning when the game opened and they're like, nope, he's cleared. He's good to go. Coming off of a Monday night concussion, clearing protocol, and then just delivering that dominant of a performance, Pacheco really needs to be talked about more. And I think that next season, when it comes to drafts, he's going to be well in the RB1, borderline RB2 conversation. And then finally, Brees Hall, 84 rushing yards and 9 receptions for 42 yards and a touchdown. This guy has just been on fire. It doesn't matter who the quarterback is, whether it's Zach Wilson, whether it's Trevor Simeon. He did have a couple of down weeks, but they have learned that if they incorporate him in the passing game, that this is where you find your absolute solid gold. And he completely delivered over the past 2 weeks. If you had him in the championship, you are living large right now. So for the wide receivers, obviously my favorite of this group is CeeDee Lamb. 13 receptions. 13. Taylor Swift's lucky number 13 for 227 yards and a touchdown. I know that this game is mired in some controversy based on what happened in that final drive and the refs, but we still can't take away what Lamb did and how amazing that performance was. One of the all time greats. I think that he's going to be in the discussion for one of the top fantasy receivers next season because unlike Justin Jefferson, who has some uncertainty at the quarterback position, um, even even Jamar Chase, is Joe Burrow going to be back in time with that wrist injury? Lamb, we know that Dak is completely solidified in his role. We know what we've got with him, and that chemistry just keeps getting better and better every single season. Coming in number 2, Devontae Adams, also with a lucky number 13 receptions, but only for 126 and 2 touchdowns. I know that Adams let everybody down last week and he was really hard to start, but this week he came back in a big way and showed everyone why he is one of, if not the best receivers in the NFL. And age isn't slowing him down at all. So, love to see that from him, especially with a backup quarterback, although they did unfortunately lose. Coming in third is my guy, DJ Moore. I was so hype on him coming into this week, and he did not let me down. 9 receptions for 159 yards and a touchdown. Now, Cole Kmet was playing, he was active, but he didn't do anything. Justin Fields only had eyes for DJ Moore this week, and it really, really paid off if you had the confidence to start him in your lineups for the championship week. I know that I did, and that was a big reason why I came home with the championship. So for tight ends, couple outliers here. Juwan Johnson leading the way as tight end 1 with 8 receptions for 90 yards and a touchdown. And this game was so crazy because I was very focused on Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. The Bucks had given up a ton of yardage and fantasy points to the wide receiver position, but unfortunately, for those of us who started the Saints wide receivers, this passing game went through Juwan Johnson. Almost half of their yards were as a result of Juwan Johnson. Got to give him mega kudos there. Then, as we mentioned, Isaiah Likely, only 2 catches for 42 yards, but he did have those 2 touchdowns. And that one catch that he had, where he just stuck his hand out, one handed grabbed it, pulled it in, and then ran all the way into the end zone. Completely amazing. This guy needs to be incorporated way more, even when Mark Andrews comes back and is healthy, because he's showing that he's got that dog in him, as the kids say. Finally, rounding out the top three is David Njoku, 6 receptions for 134 yards. Everybody had been talking about him like he couldn't gain yards after the catch, like he couldn't do this. Um, well, he shook off those haters for sure. Then with the defenses, Texans, Jaguars, and Bills rounding out the top three. A little bit weird, not gonna lie. I did not expect the Texans defense to do as well as they did because they had a lot of injuries. But obviously, Will Levis going out put a damper on every bit of their offense, and they were able to put up 22 and a half points in a league that I was facing them in. I was a little nervous about that. So going to some fantasy duds, obviously we have to talk about Patrick Mahomes finishing as QB 25. 245 yards, which isn't bad passing, but only 1 touchdown. I don't know what's going on with the Chiefs offense. Excuse me. Sorry. I've lost my voice screaming at all the football this week. Um, but only 1 touchdown, and that was to Pacheco. Travis Kelsey cannot get involved. Rushy Rice got involved a little bit, but even though he went down in the red zone, they still couldn't convert. They have major problems on this offense, and it really does make me worry when they have to play a playoff game away from Arrowhead for the first time in Mahomes' career. So, gotta watch that. Obviously, running back Alvin Kamara went out early with injury, ended up as RB 42. Tony Pollard did not have a good game against the Lions. I wasn't really expecting him to, but I was not expecting RB 47 numbers from him. Derrick Henry, RB 56, and then Austin Eckler, RB 58. Just really, really disappointing here. For wide receivers, Chris Olave, as we mentioned, didn't really get any work in that routing of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Wide receiver 65. T. Higgins, wide receiver 82. Although he did go out with an injury, he had a couple drops when he came back in. So I did expect that number to be higher. And then Tyler Lockett, wide receiver 93. It seems like finally Tyler Lockett has been eclipsed in favor of Jackson Smith and Jigba. And we were expecting this to happen at some point in the season, but I think it's finally here. For tight end, we mentioned Travis Kelsey, tight end 34 on the week. Yuck. What is going on? And before any of you guys out there say Taylor Swift, she is not on the field. She is not throwing footballs. She is not lining up in formations. She is not doing any of that. So do not blame Taylor Swift. Kate Otten also had a horrific game since Chris Godwin came back from injury. He's just kind of been invisible. Tight end 42. And then Cole Kmet and Kyle Pitts with big fat zeros all across the board. Not what you want to see from them, especially out of a guy like Kyle Pitts, who you think may be finally coming on. So those are our duds and our studs for this week. Jerry in the chat, hello to you as well. Great to see you there. But I want to know if you guys have downloaded the Bettercast app. I know a lot of you have because I've seen you in there in the chat during these games. But for those of you who don't know, we are gamifying Monday Night Football and football in general on the Bettercast app. You can chat in our live chat. You can answer prop questions before the game. You can play props, what will happen next throughout the game. And if you win, you will win tickets that you can redeem for real, authentic merchandise. And it's not just the NFL. We have it for the NBA. I think we've got it going on for the college football games tonight. So go ahead and scan that QR code, jump in there with us, or go to the Apple app and Google Play stores and jump in. It's going to be so much fun. Also, our All Pro subscription for fantasy football. If you guys need any other proof of how much this subscription does for you, go look at Howard Bender's Twitter account. Go look at my Twitter account. Go look at Seller's Twitter account. We have brought home so many fantasy championships this year. And although fantasy football is over, baseball's right around the corner and we're about to get started. So scan that QR code that was on the screen just now, or go to fantasyalarm.com/win and use promo code Let's Go for 50% off your first month. So with that, now that our matchups are pretty much all wrapped up, let's go look back on the year and talk about some of our picks that did well, some that didn't do so well, and some of our sleepers that really rewarded us. So we'll be right back after this quick break.
What can we expect for you out there on the track tonight?
Listen, I have a wife, 2 kids. I have, full-time jobs. I'm never nervous. I don't even know what that word means. Can you explain what nervous means? No. I'm ready to have fun. I've never done anything like this before. I got asked to be a part of this. This is fascinating. Like, it's so cool to just look around and see what goes on here. So I'm just excited to get out on the horse. And you want trash talk? Is that what you're asking me for? No trash talk. I hope everyone does well.
All right. Everyone's going to do well, but it has to be a winner. So give me your trifecta. Who's going to come in first, second, and third? Your heat.
I will go Maria 1, me 2, Willie 3, Moose goes 4th.
Well, it's very simple. I won this event last year. I won my heat, and so the defending champ has to be the favorite. Now, that makes me a little nervous just because I feel like it's hard to repeat. There's a little pressure when you're the favorite. But that being said, I'm still optimistic.
So your heat, it's you,
yes,
Moose and Keith from Better Sports Network, and Willie Colon.
I think Keith might be my stiffest competition. And I asked for this because I actually recruited Keith, if you didn't know. So Keith, if you win, you're welcome.
Malusis is very good. I mean, he knows what he's doing. But I'm going to go with Maria.
Keith is waving to the crowd. He must pay attention because they're off. It's Mark Malusis going for the lead. Maria Marino on the outside. And now Keith Irizarry on the outside with speed. And they're 3 wide into the first turn. Woo! Mark Malusis is locked in for his life. 138 and 2. They're into the stretch. Sportscasters Derby 2. And still in front, Keith Irizarry. And now Mark Malusis is trying to squeeze on through. Come on! Come on! Let's go! Take it! Yeah! Keith Irizarry. Keith, you did it all the way, wire to wire. Over Mark Malusis.
That was so cool. The champ is here. Keith, what was it like being out there? Adrenaline rush. You were doing the Instagram live, so there was no panic. You looked cool, calm, collected the whole time, and you won it.
I felt really comfortable. I did. Like, I know you were joking with me before. Are you nervous? Are you whatever? What are you? David, the driver, was awesome. He's like, we're going to win this. I said, all right, let's win this. And he said, let's go. Yeah, I just felt really comfortable. I did. It was fun. We're in the lead. I got Maria Marino on the right side of me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's going to beat us, right? And then out of nowhere, you see Moose coming up this way, and we feel him breathing down our neck. And I'm like,
Moose on the loose. Watch out.
Moose was definitely on the loose, and we just got Moose by a neck, a nose, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, but again, all of this for a great cause, and it was absolutely awesome to do this. It was cool.
All right, Keith, congratulations, and no matter what, you can always hold this over Moose's head.
Yeah!
Literally winner music, because we're all winners here. And Jerry in the chat said that he won 3 out of 5 leagues from the advice this year. So there you go. That is so exciting. And I love to hear that. Thank you so much for being here and listening to us and just supporting everything that we do, because as a content creator, first and foremost, I'm a football lover. That is why I got into content creation, and just being able to share my love of football with you guys really makes everything worth it, especially when you bring home championships. So, on that note, let's talk about some of the people who did help you bring home these championships and talk about some of our fantasy heroes for this season. For the quarterback, I'm going to go with Jordan Love. And he was on waivers. I know that he had a little bit of a down spiral in the middle of the season, but in the back half, he came on super, super strong. He was QB5 on the year. And as I mentioned earlier, I did not believe in him. I did not think that the situation was good for him as far as his receivers went. I thought that they were too young, that they didn't have enough depth, yada, 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 on and on and on. But kudos to him because he hung in there even when his receiving core was injured. He hung in there even when the chips were down against him. Jordan Love had an absolute fantastic season, and we love to see that. Stupid pun. Please forgive me. Don't leave the chat. For my running back, I'm going to start out with Raheem Mostert. And I know that Howard Bender has talked about this all year long, that he was drafted in the 10th or 11th round of most drafts. And even though he didn't play in the championship week, he was still the RB2 in PPR formats through 16 weeks. And that to me is worth it. He helped us get there. He led the league in rushing touchdowns. And for that, I'm very thankful. I'm saying this as a Mostert manager who had to find somebody else to start in his place. The fact that he was so solid all year long and got me to the championship, that's enough. Thank you for being my hero. Obviously, next we have to talk about Kieran Williams because he was the waiver wire darling. After week 1, I made fun of my husband for spending as much fab on Kieran Williams as he did. But you know what? He was RB5 overall in PPR leagues. Even after that stint on IR, he averaged 21.3 fantasy points per game. Just an absolute stud. He didn't have a great game yardage wise this week, but those 3 touchdowns are just chef's kiss all the way. And I think that he will be going very early in drafts next season. Jerry, I see ya. Puka Nakua was mine. He's my next one as well. You got him off of waivers in the second week. He was still on waivers after week 1. That is insane. Good on you for scooping him up and recognizing that, because he was the wide receiver 5 in PPR formats, just 17.8 fantasy points per game. He really did come out of nowhere. So if you scooped him up on the waiver wire, you had a good day yesterday in your championship game, as Jerry obviously points out. 96 receptions on 145 targets with 1,327 receiving yards. I don't see how this kid doesn't win Rookie of the Year. I know that CJ Stroud was good and kind of came out of nowhere, but this is a 5th round receiver putting up these numbers. I think that you have to factor that into Rookie of the Year, and this kid was just bananas. He was so good. Next up for my wide receiver, I'm going to go with Mike Evans, who was wide receiver 7 in PPR formats with 17.3 fantasy points per game. And we all kind of thought that Baker's low depth of target would benefit Chris Godwin more. We were seeing Evans fall a little bit in ADP, but Mayfield aired it out. He was not afraid to throw it deep to Mike Evans. And for the 10th consecutive season, Evans had over 1,000 receiving yards, and he also leads the NFL with 13 touchdowns. Great numbers from him. And I think that he is definitely making a case for not only one of the best players contemporarily, but for a Hall of Fame ballot. Coming up with a couple of rookies next, I'm going to go with Rashee Rice, wide receiver 21 in PPR formats with 13.3 fantasy points per game. And he really emerged as the Chiefs wide receiver 1 this season. He's had a really good second half of the year. He's garnered a lot of targets. He's been able to gain yards after the catch. This guy is the kind of explosive playmaker that they all thought that Kadarius Toney was going to be. So do not be surprised to see Rice go fairly high next season in your fantasy drafts. I'm also going with Jaden Reed, which I know that Jerry has because we were talking about this on Twitter last night. Jaden Reed was the wide receiver 28 with 13 and a half fantasy points per game. And he did miss a few games, but he is what LaFleur calls the war daddy, whatever that means. So if you had him last night, you were singing his praises. I know that he helped Jerry win a fantasy championship. So kudos to Jaden Reed right there. And then, of course, my guy, Sam Laporta. Guys, tight end one. Who can we throw that rookie tight end narrative out the entire window right now? Because a rookie tight end finished as the tight end one. He had 14.1 fantasy points per game. The Laporta Potty Romper Stompers absolutely crushed this season, and he was a touchdown machine. He had 776 receiving yards on 74 receptions, but he also had 9 touchdowns, which led all tight ends. So please, let's kick this little narrative out the window. So for my zeros, unfortunately, I do have to just address some things that happened. And first is Joe Burrow. Yes, he got injured. He missed some games, but honestly, he wasn't looking great before the injury happened. He was only averaging 15.3 fantasy points per game, and where you were drafting him as a top 4 or 5 option, just not what you wanted out of Joe Burrow this season. My next guy is going to be Austin Eckler, who was RB25 in PPR leagues, which, isn't bad. He's a flex, but he was being drafted as a top option in the first or second round. Only 571 rushing yards, 394 receiving yards. He was not what you needed him to be. And yes, he was also injured, blah, 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 but he still only averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game, which is way off of where he was the past 2 seasons and not what you were looking for in your first or second round pick. Alexander Madison is my next guy, RB36 in PPR leagues with just 8.6 fantasy points per game. And we were thinking that Madison was going to just completely take over for Dalvin Cook, blah, 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 blah. But he did not. He looked pretty bad all year long. And Ty Chandler ended up taking his job. Madison looked slow. He looked inefficient. And obviously, while the injury to Kirk Cousins didn't help anything, he didn't look efficient even before that injury. So Alexander Madison was a big bust. Another bust is correlating with the Joe Burrow pick, going with T. Higgins, wide receiver 48 with 11.5 fantasy points per game. And yes, he was also hurt, but he was very boomer bust. He could be inefficient. As I mentioned yesterday, he dropped a couple of balls that could have put the Bengals into at least field goal range, if not better. Everything that we saw out of T. Higgins this season was not what we were expecting, and it just wasn't great. Another guy is Marquise Brown, wide receiver 49 with just 9.6 fantasy points per game. Obviously, he started the season without Kyler Murray, but with his target share, he should have put up better numbers. I personally do not think that he's going to be with the Cardinals next season because I think that they're cleaning house. I don't know that they keep Kyler Murray. And a reason for bringing Marquise Brown over was because Kyler Murray was his quarterback in college and they had this rapport and this relationship, blah, 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 blah. If they get rid of Kyler, I do not see Marquise Brown staying with the Cardinals next season. And this performance did not help his chances this year. Finally, for wide receivers, we've got Deontay Johnson, wide receiver 50 with 11.2 fantasy points per game. Obviously, again, he was injured, but when he has multiple games of just 2 or 3 points, you can't trust him. That's not a wide receiver that you want in your lineup. Until honestly they get the quarterback and or offensive coordinator situation figured out, I don't think that you can trust anybody on this Steelers offense. Another offense that you really can't trust anybody on, thanks Arthur Smith, is Kyle Pitts, who was the tight end 14 with 8.3 fantasy points per game. And I don't know if I'll be drafting any Falcons next season if Arthur Smith is still the coach because you can't trust their usage. It's not a great offense to be investing in if you want week to week production. As we saw this week, championship week, Kyle Pitts with a big fat 0. We hate that. Pulling out my inner golem here. Pat Fryermuth rounds out the duds with tight end 30, only 6.6 fantasy points per game. Now, he had games with literal zeros, and much like Deontay Johnson, until they get their quarterback situation figured out, I cannot trust anybody on this Steelers offense. Now for our favorite sleeper, and I know that I've got people in the chat already talking about Laporta. He, again, was the tight end 1. I had him in 4 out of 5 of my championship games. He is my overall fantasy MVP this season. He was basically free in drafts, and he really did pay dividends. Everyone was all over Dalton Kincaid, but Laporta was actually the guy that you wanted. And again, let's please throw out this narrative that rookie tight ends cannot produce. Let's just throw it out. It's lazy, it's outdated. Laporta has crunched that narrative. Let's go, baby. Angelo in the chat says our leagues still have week 18 to go, so we have to figure out who will be sitting, like CMC. Yeah, I do think that CMC will be sitting. There are also a lot of incentive-based plays that have players who are playing to get contract advantages, things like that. So be checking that out as the week goes on, and that'll make your start sit easier. We will also be doing a start sit show, not at the normal time on Sunday, but at 11 a.m. Eastern with myself and John and Pimba, and we'll get you ready to go and let you know who will be sitting as those inactives come out. So tune in for that. So real quick for my bounce back players, because I'm just rambling on here, Baker Mayfield, QB9 with 17.4 fantasy points per game. Look, this guy wasn't even on a team last year, and now he finishes as a QB1. I mean, how does this happen? We talked about him revitalizing Mike Evans towards the end of the season. He revitalized Chris Godwin. It's just an awesome season overall that Baker Mayfield put together, and something that you really like to see. Breece Hall, also complete bounce back player. RB4 in PPR leagues with 16.3 fantasy points per game. Even on this bad Jets team with a revolving door of quarterbacks coming back from an ACL tear, Breece Hall balled. He balled. Have to be clear here, I was very worried about him beginning the season because I was worried about the inefficiency coming back from the ACL, blah, 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 blah. But Breece Hall shook that narrative, and he absolutely crushed. For my bounce back wide receiver, I've got Keenan Allen, who was wide receiver 6 in PPR leagues with 21.5 fantasy points per game, which is third among all wide receivers, just behind Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb. Now, everyone was out on him coming into this year because he missed some time last season, yada, yada, yada. But he absolutely crushed. It really sucks that he missed the fantasy playoffs, but he did help get you there. And that's what you can ask for out of him. David Njoku is my tight end 6 with 12.6 fantasy points per game. Even with all the quarterback issues, Njoku crushed the second half of the season. The targets, the yards after the catch, the touchdowns, everything that you wanted out of Njoku was what you got the second half of the season. And he really revitalized his career. For my rookies, real quick, CJ Stroud, QB 13 with 8.5 fantasy points per game. Just think what he's going to look like with another year in the system. When the weapons are better, when the offensive line is better. I have very high hopes for CJ Stroud. Jahmyr Gibbs, RB8 in PPR formats with 16.7 fantasy points per game. Yes, he did let you down some over the past 2 games, but he helped get you there, and he was definitely much more consistent than Bijan Robinson. And I think that the Lions are really building something special, and he's going to have many, many good years to come. We've talked about him already, but Puka Nacua has to round out the favorite rookie wide receiver. As good as Rashee Rice was, as good as Jaden Reed was. Wide receiver 5 with 17.8 points per game. What else is there to say about Puka? aside from the fact that he is amazing. And I will admit again that I was nervous about spending so much fab on him because what was it going to look like when Cooper Cup came back? Things like that. But he shut those doubts down. You already know who my favorite rookie tight end is going to be. We're going back with Sam Laporta with 14.1 fantasy points per game. And honestly, what is there left to say about Laporta that hasn't yet been said? I absolutely love this guy, love what he did for all my fantasy teams, and I love what he did for the tight end rookie narrative so that people can just shake everything and have to really reevaluate their process. So, we are going to take a very quick break here before we do our fantasy football therapy session. And we've heard some of yours on Twitter/X, but the therapist needs therapy too. So, we're going to start with some of my issues for week 17. Obviously, Brian Burns moonlights as a therapist occasionally, and he has been so kind to offer me help with my issues. So, we're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, welcome to the Fantasy Therapy Lounge.
Of the NHL games, I had a conversation with Coop A Fiasco yesterday when we were producing High Stakes, and he was talking about playing video games. And since he covers fantasy football, I said, "Hey, are you going to be getting the new Madden this year?" And he goes, "Yeah, I don't really play Madden. I play NHL." And that tells you, and it really does, that I do feel that the NHL game is better than Madden. I feel like Madden is overrated. The NHL game is so realistic. I don't know if you guys saw the trailer and all the new additions that they added to this game, but it really looks good. I tried finding all the games that I had of NHL, and I thought I had a lot. I only have 4 of them. And that's because I used to live with my my roommate and good friend who got me into hockey, and we would play most of it in his house. So he has most of the games, but I do got 21.
There you go.
I got NHL 18. We got Connor McDavid up there. NHL 12, I think, was the start of the new consoles for me. But the big one, the holy grail of NHL games. NHL 94 for the Sega Genesis right there. Look at that. Look at that beautiful cover. Look at it. Looks like a VHS tape. That's how good this game is.
Now, let me stop you right there. So people, VHS tape, if you don't know, it's this like rectangular black plastic with the magnetic tape on the inside. Tape's this big. You put it in something called a VCR. For a little while, there was something called Beta. It didn't last too long.
Look at this cartridge. I mean, they're not cartridges anymore. They're either discs or those little memory cards. But man, that thing is thick, right? And
you don't even need a cartridge or a disc anymore. You can buy the digital version.
And then you got Ron Barr on the book. I mean, he used to be always in the intro telling you about the team and what was going to be happening in the game. So NHL 94 is by far my favorite game, sports game. I love that game.
Welcome back in, guys. This is the Fantasy Therapy Lounge. Because whether you won or lost, I know that you guys all have some big feelings about this week. And I need to get mine off my chest. So if my lovely therapist/producer, Brian Burns, is ready to go, I'm ready to come into the lounge.
All right. So, Britt, we've made some progress since our last session. Tell me what's going on.
I am. I'm a lot happier than I was last session. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about players who knocked me out of the playoffs, but I went into 3 matches yesterday, walked away with 3 titles. All the hard work and sadness and stress that happened after week 15 is gone. And I just feel like everything that I put in this week was very well worth it.
Okay. You've also expressed that you're feeling some abandonment. Let's dive into that.
Yeah, as much as I'm feeling better about, what happened in week 15 and I won these championships, I still do feel a little left out in the cold about Kyle Pitts and Cole Kmet. I'm in another league that points go all the way towards the end of the season. So even if you're not competing in the championship, you can still get money for points. So I was still very much in that points race. I started Kyle Pitts over K. Otten because K. Otten had disappeared and I couldn't use him. And he actually got me 1.5 points in that league because of a tackle that he made on an interception. It wasn't a complete zero, but it is an IDP league, and still 1.5 points is not great. As far as Cole Kmet, he had that monster game last week. People thought that DJ Moore was going to be shut down. He just vanished and put up a zero. And so I'm wondering why they had to leave me during my fantasy championship.
Britt, it's not so much that they left you; it's that you feel like they left you, but they didn't really. So we'll get more into that. But what I really wanted to get into is I'm seeing here in my notes that you have feelings of survivor's guilt, and with survivor's guilt, you need to acknowledge what you have been through, allow yourself some time to mourn, and finally be open about what you're going through. So tell me a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, it kind of sucks when people you've relied upon all year let you down. And even though I won some matchups, I feel bad for a lot of other people who didn't because their studs didn't come through for them. So for one, it's Baker Mayfield started playing like it was 2022 again. He completely fell off um, from where he was early on in the season, even against that Saints defense that didn't have Marshawn Lattimore. Mike Evans completely went missing on a milk carton. Same with Rashad White. It was his lowest point total of the entire season, I believe. I had him in a league. Luckily, I won, but they just didn't show up. Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave completely disappeared. So even though I won, I was recommending these players and thought that they were going to have good games. And when they didn't, I felt really bad. And I hope that even though my process was correct, that they still got past these bad players. Also, the injuries with Devonta Smith, with Alvin Kamara. You've been riding these guys all season long, and suddenly in week 17, things go wrong. And it just makes it very difficult as somebody giving advice to say, well, they got hurt. You can't, suck it up, deal with it next year. But that's kind of where I am right now. It is luck. Fantasy football is skill, but a lot of it is luck when it comes to injuries.
That's true. And I want to get back to the experimental therapy that we've been doing where we do a little role play where you become the therapist. So let's dive back into that.
Yeah, so there were a couple things on Twitter that people sent. Chuck Bass says, "So what brings you in for therapy today, Mr. Bass?" And it is a screenshot of Tyreek Hill with 10.6 points going up against Greg Dortch, who had 11.7 points. And again, I feel like you cannot blame yourself for what happened here. You followed the process, you did very well. You cannot account for Tyreek Hill dropping that ball in the end zone. You cannot account for Greg Dortch being as, good as he was against the Eagles. You followed the process and your process got you here. So I don't think that you can blame yourself for that. And Matt says, came up 3.86 points short. He dropped the Texans defense for the Raiders, which was a 21-point swing, and then swapped out Reed when Chase was ruled in. Salty in today. So I think what you did with your defense, we kind of preach about it all the time, to not just stream defenses all the time because you're just chasing those touchdowns and the sacks and the points there. When it comes to swapping out Reed when Chase was ruled in, I feel like that was the correct decision because Chase is an alpha wide receiver. Reed was also dealing with an injury, not only to his chest, but to his toe, and he did eventually get ruled out. I think that you followed your process and you cannot beat yourself up too much about what you did. I think that's it. Well, Grumpy Sports Fan in the chat says played Noah Brown instead of Reed. Why do I always do this to myself? I I honestly, going into Sunday, I think that I would have taken Reed or taken Brown over Reed because of the Titans' pass defense. And I thought with CJ Stroud back, he's going to look very good. Reed had been dealing with those double injuries. Um, I'm just, I think that your process was correct. I really do. So I don't think that you can blame yourself. Again, you're given a select amount of data and you follow that data. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But as long as you're following a process, as long as you're following that data, just know that you're in the right with what you're doing. And yes, Jerry and Angelo in the chat both say we overthink too much. And I can be totally honest here. I was freaking out yesterday because of the Zay Flowers news saying that he was going to be on a snap count and that he wasn't going to play as many snaps, blah, 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 blah. So I, at the last minute, tinkered and pulled him out and left 20 points on my bench. Luckily, I still won, but the overthinking does not end. It happens to the best of us, just let me tell you. So do not worry about overthinking. Best thing I can say if you are trying to decide between a player is just follow your gut and shake off these beat writers. Okay. The beat writers, as valuable as they are and as much information as they do bring us, they can spook us from time to time when it comes to being on a snap count. Just go with your gut. Go with your gut. Not as 100% of your process, but make sure to incorporate that in your process. I just want to congratulate everybody out there who brought home a fantasy championship. I also want to thank you for riding with me all season long. This has been so much fun. I completely love what I do, and I love that you guys can enjoy it with me. So, really, really appreciate you there. On one quick note, make sure that you guys go to Sleeper. I'm sure that a lot of your leagues are housed on Sleeper. And if you haven't played the sleeper picks, what are you waiting for? I think that you need to go down there and check out sleeper picks. You can download the app by scanning the QR code on the screen. And we still have a 100% deposit match up to $100 using the promo code VAULT3. Download that today. We've got not only a whole other week of football, we've got playoffs. We have a lot of people with incentives. Just because we won our championships does not mean that fantasy football stops. So make sure that you go and do that today. Thank you guys so much for being in the chat. If you do have week 18 matchups, tune in to myself and John and Pemba for week 18 at 11 a.m. Eastern on this same channel. And we'll be giving you the start sits. Download the BetterCast app. Go to Fantasy Alarm and check out our All Pro subscription because obviously we have a ton of winners, right? This just is a testament to what we do over there and all the hard work that we put in. But I just want to thank you guys so much for a wonderful season. I'll be back on Friday breaking down Sunday's games. But until then, have a very, very happy new year. And thank you so much for getting blitzed.